Welcome to Retina, where Retina conversations happen. I'm Scott Krzywonos.
And I'm John Kitchens.
John, normally the time between AAO and angiogenesis is a dead period, but not this time around. There's been a handful of stories that broke over the past few weeks. We selected two of them to talk about today. The first one is the GLOBE project, which will significantly disrupt drug pricing in the United States. And the second one is EYLEA HD's new label, which expands its indication to include RVO, and it also allows monthly dosing. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with the GLOBE project. And Scott, I'll tell you, there's not been many things that I've gotten more texts and emails from colleagues about than this GLOBE project. And this was something you and I actually got a little bit of a preview of back at the Cencora meeting when David, one of the VPs at Cencora, actually talked about changes that were coming. And we hope to eventually have David on the podcast, or somebody from Cencora on the podcast who can talk about the changes with great authority. But it kind of left us both kind of looking at each other going, I don't remember hearing about this. Like, what is this thing? And it kind of was a very forward-looking talk, so it wasn't a definitive thing. Then late last week, we kind of got hit with this sudden announcement that said that they're going to be doing this Medicare demonstration project called the GLOBE Project, looking at Medicare Part B drugs, which are physician-administered drugs, anti-VEGFs, our complement inhibitors that we give now, and trying to basically equilibrate the pricing and lower the pricing in the United States by implementing this most favored nation pricing, where the U.S. pays the lowest common price of all the international prices.
Right. It looks at a group of peer nations and decides what the lowest price is after adjusting for some factors like GDP and purchasing power parity, to then say, okay, well, this is the lowest price that Switzerland is paying. That's the price we're paying too.
Yeah, and this, if you think about it, the price we pay, and the U.S. pays by far the highest price for drugs, and some of that helps facilitate the innovation. Some of it actually helps hospitals make, profits. Some of it, is allocated as rebates, discounts, a 4.3% handling fee that's a government instituted thing. But it all results in a big profit maker for practices, hospitals, and other things. And so anything that really disrupts that pricing and brings down that pricing substantially could have an overall impact on buy and bill drugs, which is primarily what we do.
So let's stop for a second and just set the table with a quick social studies lesson. So over the last three presidential administrations, Trump 1, Biden, and then Trump 2, they've all focused on getting pharmaceutical prices under control. So in Trump 1, there was the most favored nation rules, which you talked about. This pegged U.S. drug prices to foreign drug prices. The courts said that it couldn't go forward on procedural grounds. Under the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act did allow CMS to start negotiating drug prices, which they did for a handful of drugs. And now this time in the second Trump administration, there's kind of two tactics to reducing drug prices for consumers, right? The first one is tariff relief for some manufacturers if they lower consumer prices. And then the second one, yes, is this GLOBE project with the same mechanism that we described before. This is not just affecting ophthalmology, though, right? It's affecting some other specialties.
Yeah, anybody who does buy and bill, primarily oncology, they're a big one as far as that goes. And the oncologists have always been well ahead of the game when it comes to trying to figure out, how to deal with decreasing reimbursement on drugs and decreasing profitability of drugs. The second is rheumatology. They do a lot of buy and bill physician administered drugs.
So when we say buy and bill, what does that mean exactly? And what is that opposed to? Like, what are some of the other models?
Yeah, so primarily in ophthalmology clinics and retina clinics, what we do is we buy these anti-VEGF drugs, these complement inhibitors, any drugs that we give, we're buying them from a distributor, and we're administering them to the patients, and then we're billing for them. And in the course of doing that, there's going to be some handling fees that we get. There's some rebates and discounts that we get that help offset that kind of handling fee, and actually can more than offset it, make it somewhat profitable, especially if you're a very busy practice, if you're a large practice, if you're an institutional practice like a university, or if you're a private equity group that has a lot of practices under your belt.
Now, the implementation of the GLOBE project is not nationwide indefinitely. This is going to be a test run over a 7-year period, only covering about 25% of geographic locations selected randomly. I know that there's a lot of moving parts here. We're still trying to figure it out. But in your estimation, what does that mean if you're in one of those 25% of practices that are going to be affected by this?
Yeah, so I don't think we know actually what it means, but I think it ultimately means that there's going to be a potential that you're paid less for these drugs, that the price of the drugs come down, which is ultimately what it's all about, making healthcare more affordable. But as the price comes down, your potential to garner, a rebate that makes it more worthwhile to use the more expensive drugs could be very affected, and ultimately your profitability, will come down on handling these drugs and administering these drugs. I also think there's going to be an additional administrative burden that's built into this as they kind of help to start to navigate how this is going to be done. And so I think if you're in that 25% of regions that they're looking at this, it could be fairly impactful, and it could require a lot of paperwork, a lot of administrative time, and then certainly once again on that profitability of drugs, if the price of the drug comes down and it's a percentage, your margin is a percentage of the
Right.
drug, and that doesn't go up, you're going to see less on the back end.
You mentioned that a lot of your colleagues were reaching out to you. You were all kind of in text chains and email chains about this. Were retina specialists caught flat-footed on this, or is this something that they saw coming down the pike?
I think the majority of retina specialists weren't aware that this is something. I certainly wasn't aware that it was going to be announced. I knew, like, since we went to the Syncora meeting, that there was going to be something coming, and there seems like there's always something on the horizon, Scott. And I think we also get a little bit kind of tone deaf to these things because we're constantly hearing that there's going to be this change or that, and then somehow at the last minute it's put off. But this certainly looks like something that's going to roll forward, and I think Retina was a little bit surprised. ASRS, to their credit, sent an email as soon as it was instituted saying, "Hey, we're opposed to this," but there's just not a lot of information out there, and so I think a Google search, and then for me, learning a lot from AI, where I put things into Chat GPT and Notebook LM and find web sources and try to summarize those has really helped kind of understand this better.
Yeah, I'm curious if lay media is going to be covering this anytime soon too, because it is a major change, and I could see patients thinking that it's good news. So we'll see. John, just want to shift gears. Let's go over EYLEA HD's expanded label. So in November, the FDA expanded EYLEA HD's label to include RVO. And it also, and I think this might even be the bigger news, it allowed monthly dosing for patients who did not respond favorably to extended dosing after the loading dose period. What do you think this means for practices and for Regeneron?
Yeah, this is, first of all, something we've been looking forward to for quite a while. There's been a couple of times that it's been put off by the FDA, mainly because there were some issues with a non-Regeneron owned filler that was actually filling some of the medicine. And so the FDA had some issues with that, and that looks like it's rectified now. But basically, this allows us really the biggest thing, which is the ability to treat these patients with monthly injections. And I think one of the weaknesses of the EYLEA HD label was that you could treat patients with wet AMD or diabetic macular edema monthly for 3 months, and then the most frequent you could treat those patients was every 7 or 8 weeks, mostly 7 weeks, because Medicare gives you a little bit of grace, their insurance gives you a little bit of grace period there. The biggest issue with that is that when these new medicines come out, Scott, we use them on our toughest to treat patients. And those are the patients that you're struggling to get out to 5 or 6 weeks with, then another second generation agent like faricimab. And so you switch them over and you might see a little greater drying effect. But if you can't get the patient all the way to 7 weeks, then after 3 initial monthly injections, you really are lost, and you have to go back to either aflibercept monthly or faricimab every 4 to 5 weeks to maintain that dry retina. And so with this enhanced flexibility, fortunately now we're going to be able to use this up to every month in patients, and that should allow us to keep these patients a little bit drier. It's funny, when something like this happens, it always takes insurance a while to catch up. So in our practice right now, we're doing a couple of patients that are Medicare patients to see, are we going to get paid if we keep doing monthly injections, or are we going to get, some denials and going to have to fight those denials? And similarly, in the expansion of the label, they've added vein occlusion. So in our practice, we've picked a couple patients out each
Okay.
of us with vein occlusions, and we're treating them and we're submitting those claims and seeing if they get paid. Because when something like this changes, it always takes a little time before the insurance actually gets caught up with it.
Back to the wet AMD question, right? Being able to treat monthly. I remember back at ASRS this year looking at the PAT survey, and there was a question that said, insurance considerations aside, what would be your first line dose for a patient with wet AMD who's presenting to the first time for your clinic? And fewer than 10% of respondents in the United States said EYLEA HD, which surprised me. I thought it would be maybe a quarter. And there was a retina specialist I was chatting with, and I asked, if that surprised him, and he said no, because the label was so restrictive. He said, I don't want to start dosing this patient and then be hamstrung by some label issue. So I'd be curious to see if they asked that question in the 2026 PAT survey and what the difference is.
So I think there's three main obstacles. I think the dosing was an obstacle, obviously, probably the biggest obstacle. The second obstacle is still there is prefilled syringe. I mean, that's a problem as far as that goes. People love prefilled syringes. There's been a demonstrated lower rate of endophthalmitis with prefilled syringes, and it just makes it easier to use. And then the third thing is the cost, and the cost is still a fair amount more expensive for the higher dose of aflibercept than faricimab. And so I think that cost may be a factor as well, although that's usually the last factor as far as that goes. So I think one of those three things taken out of the equation. I think the second one, sometime in 2026, we'll see a prefilled syringe for HD. And then I think, we might see some adjustment on cost. I don't know, but it sure would be nice to see it priced a little more in parity with the other second generation agents.
All right, well, let's take a quick break. And when we get back, we're going to speak with Rishi Singh. He's the chair of the Department of Ophthalmology at Mass Eye and Ear and Mass General Brigham up at Harvard. Stick with us. We'll be back with Rishi. Hey listeners, we'll have a couple of mailbag episodes coming up. If you would like to submit a recording with a question for John, email a voice recording to info@retinup.com. That's RETINUP.com. John, we covered some major shakeups in retina leadership that occurred in 2025, and one of those shakeups was at Harvard. Dr. Rishi Singh has been handed the baton from Joan Miller as the chair of the Department of Ophthalmology at Mass Eye and Ear. And Rishi contains multitudes. He's one of our favorite people. This new leadership role is not the only reason that we're having him on Retina. He's a really smart, brilliant mind. He directs the discourse in Retina. And we're really honored to have him here. Rishi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Scott and John.
Rishi, it's so amazing to think that a friend and a colleague and somebody in my era actually is a chairman at a place like Harvard. First of all, that's got to be just a kind of pinch yourself moment. Has it really settled in and settled home for you yet?
I don't think so. It's day 46 on the job. Who's counting at this point? I'm getting used to the surroundings and being back with my people again. For the past 3 years, I was a hospital CEO in Florida, and that was great. I really enjoyed the aspects of the healthcare industry that I learned from there, but I missed the collegiality of my colleagues in ophthalmology. I missed the science and education pieces that was part of our overall mission. And so hence coming back to Boston has been amazing. And it just feels like I'm still, the hair on the back of my neck are still standing sometimes when I'm in these meetings, but it's been great. They're a very supportive environment, a lot of resources, incredible focus on us succeeding as an organization. The organization really wants to see us grow, which is a nice departure from most of medicine right now. So it's really, really fantastic to be here.
Rishi, to step out of your role as a retina specialist, and you still saw patients when you were in Florida, but to work as that CEO, how did that challenge you? What was so different about that? How did it help you grow as a person and as a professional?
Yeah, I think that I had all of these sort of experiences before that I just hadn't put together, how to negotiate with doctors about various topics and issues, how to get to yes in a conversation with an administrator, how much, FaceTime you need to have with your staff or your people. How do you raise money? Like all of these sort of things were sort of pieces and parts I had done before. And the solidification of the job in Florida had been putting all of these together in a cohesive strategy with the team. And even then, John, I have to say, even when you get in the seat, just like as a retina specialist, your first cases, and even when you become a very seasoned retina specialist, you feel uncomfortable. And being uncomfortable has been my mantra most of my life as far as learning something, being feeling like I'm at the right space in my trajectory is when I'm a little bit uncomfortable, is when I get to learn the most about myself and the others around me. And hence, that was a great opportunity to be in Florida and have that opportunity. And this is again another challenge in Boston for a lot of reasons. And I'm looking forward to that opportunity and growing the system.
Do you feel like you're back in a comfortable position now that you're back in ophthalmology, or do you feel that same kind of discomfort because you're at an institution that you trained at but actually haven't led, and now you're in
Yeah.
the leadership, the ultimate leadership position?
Yeah, a little of both. So first, I mean, I'm back with people that I know very well, and I grew up in the area in New England, so I feel like it's a little bit of a homecoming for me. And I've met my friends and my college buddies and things like that that I knew when I was growing up there. So that's been fun. I think at the same token, all of medicine is challenged to keep our academic and research missions afloat in a very tough environment. It's a daunting task, and if it was just a small part of our work, it would be fine. It's actually a lot of our work in Boston. We're the number one or number two in research funding every year by the NEI and NIH. We're the best training program in the country. We're top four in US News Report. So all of these are at risk, right? And I think, again, that's one of the things that makes you sometimes stay up at night is making sure you have the right people and the right mentality and the right vision. Ultimately, it's about creating the vision with the people around me there. And that's been fun to start to do now. I've been, listening a lot. I've been spending my first 90 days really spending listening and taking it all in and being a sponge more than doing what doctors do, which is to prescribe as fast as possible the remedy for the solution. And that's an art form. That's hard to sometimes do, I think, for what we do in practice.
And Rishi, you alluded to this. There's a lot of change in healthcare right now. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these changes we talked about in the first block, and we'll talk about it here with you coming up. But what kind of a role do you think a amazing institution like Harvard and Mass Eye should have in helping develop policy and influencing some of the governmental affairs and policy changes and things such as that?
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to that. First, obviously, is the advocacy work, which has to be done, and clearly we are a well-known institution with a lot of thought leaders in our field that can go out and talk to those in their respective societies, which can be very collective in nature, and also on Capitol Hill through the Mid-Year Forum and other sort of academy positions and RO positions, which are valuable. So we have this tour de force, right, of all these people working in these societies and collaboratives on that side. I think on the other side of those, I have to say this because I know you've been a leader in this, John, is really around practice innovation, right? How do we take care of patients in this new era? What do we need to do differently, sustainably, to make ourselves be consistent in the future? What are the ways we embrace technology? We have been a shy user of technology for so long. Most of medicine has been a shy user. I remember before the pandemic, if you told somebody in medicine, we're going to have a web meeting, their eyes would roll back in their head and be like, you have to go to like a Staples or something and sit in the booth over there. How do you do that? Financial people did this for years, and we're just now, kind of getting up to speed on this. We have gone kicking and screaming sometimes to technology when in fact it was probably the answer we should have embraced a long time ago. And I'm glad to see that the new era of ophthalmologists, and especially people at Mass Eye are embracing technology as being part of the solution, but also learning about how can we innovate our practice, which is a great aspect to see.
You're in such a unique position, Rishi, having the MIT right there. How do you guys interface with MIT? I know they really played a major role in the development of OCT, and they have relationships with Harvard, but how do you facilitate that for those of us that aren't in that kind of Boston system?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, I think it's a multi-dimensional system, right? So Mass Eye standalone hospital for over 200 years in their own right, had Scapin's Eye Institute associated with us just a few years back, almost about 9 or 10 years ago now. Scapin's was a standalone research institute. It wasn't even part of Mass Eye. It became part of it 10 years ago. Then you add to that the layers that are within the Mass General and the Brigham system, which are two highly sought after medical systems in the country. And they have research labs and they have core facilities. And They also bring their innovations team in, which has these incubator facilities for companies. Then you add to that the things you discussed, MIT and the Broad Institute, which is really a genomics institute, which we work very closely with because we have a Center for Ocular Genomics here at Mass Eye which focuses on both glaucoma and on retinal degeneration, which has actually produced some of the recent newest drugs in retinitis pigmentosa and Stargardt disease, in fact. So hugely impactful from the standpoint of where our researchers are working. And then you add all the biotech in Boston. I mean, what a fantastic place to have this resource. And they all want to work with us in some level. I think navigating all of this is very important. I think that some of the aspects of it have been really rooted on contribution margin, not just selling ourselves for work, really contributing to that work we're doing, developing intellectual property or know-how, which are very important for us as an organization. And we have, I think one of the things that I've been, kind of tickled by was the fact that everyone sort of perceives us as a big sort of slow engine. And in fact, I found the exact opposite in Mass General Brigham. Maybe that might be true of the Harvard system, but in Mass General Brigham, they're built for speed and they want to see things happen quicker. And they're tracking how their progress is. It's quite interesting to follow all that. And I think it's been an honest group of people doing a good amount of work. We just need to figure out how to do it even better together. And that's been a huge, huge impactful thing to watch and see when I come here.
Rishi, as you talk about these things, it becomes very apparent that you're the perfect person to chair this department and lead into this very rapidly developing future because you're a facilitator. You're someone who has always been able to take things and make them happen.
Yeah.
And make them happen very rapidly. And I will talk about a couple of things. First of all, the development of meetings. You have been a phenomenal force when it comes to developing successful meetings. You played a critical role in Hawaiian Eye. And you started Retinal World Congress, and I would love to hear about how that came about. And now we're working on the first Kiowa Eye Retina meeting that's going to be in May of 2026. Want to get a pitch in there for that meeting, which I've been to the Kiowa Eye meeting before. It's a cataract meeting. Now it's going to be Retina. Fantastic meeting.
Yeah.
But where did you get involved with meetings, and how did you come up with the idea for Retinal World Congress?
Yeah, so it goes back to the roots I spoke about when we first started this conversation around just the educational mission, right? It's not just about residents and fellows; it was about the attendings, your colleagues, and your compatriots who also want to learn too. And one of the aspects that I remember when I first went to my first Hawaiian Eye meeting, which sounds very glamorous, but it is very nice place to be, but is the content is unbelievable. For that person who's starting off in fellowship, I mean, the talks that are given are so very, very good to get and so granular to get their opinions on that you can use them in practice. And I remember coming back and sharing it with all of my fellow colleagues saying, look at this stuff that they're presenting at this meeting. Because for, when you go to an abstract based meeting like, ASRS or something like that, or Academy, it's great, but you don't get sometimes that really kind of granular day to day sort of thing that you need to have as a practical nature. And so, when I took over Hawaiian Eye, it was really about getting fresh eyes onto what was there before. It was already well innovated by many of our leaders in our field, including Jay Duker and Elias Rochelle. And I was just really continuing that effort, but with fresh eyes to see what else could we do? Like, what else could we bring to the table? And hence we did a lot with expansion of the meeting. Retina World Congress, similarly, some of us in the field of retina are blessed to be able to travel over the world, but that's not a resource that's available to a lot of people. And especially during the pandemic and other times frames, that became very, very sparse and very difficult. But imagine, you go to these meetings and you've been to them and I've been to them across the world, and you see them using products that we haven't gotten yet, or you see them doing techniques that we haven't done yet, or you see them with experience of drugs that we haven't touched yet. I mean, that's so super interesting to follow. And then forget about the fact that they're doing this on very different budgets than we're doing this on, and how they can do it in a sustainable way. That to me, a Retinal World Congress was important to start, and I brought it together with 4 other founding societies at the time that really put their people involved in that, and hence that has continued on beyond me. And that's one thing I think that's a very important part of any leadership cycle and style is there's only a certain amount of years you should be in the seat for. And I really am a believer that there's a time frame to turn it over to somebody, and hence each of these things has a time frame, and each of them has a longevity. And eventually I would turn things over. I did that with the Retina Summit back in Cleveland. I remember, saying, that we had a successful meeting. for 10 plus years, I did that meeting and I said, you know what? It's time to move on. It's time to give this to a younger folk who can have some fresh eyes on this. And hence that's been there. And the Kiowa meeting and other meetings that I'm doing this year, Sunshine included, and OS and Retina, they're all very, very different in what they do. They do it in a very different fashion, and it's a very different audience each time. And it just makes it, fun and innovative to look at it in that way and to deliver content in different ways and see what people react to.
Tell us just a little bit about what to expect with the Kiowa Eye Retina meeting.
Yeah. Super concept. I think we're all used to that didactic, like, let me get up and give a talk and get a Q&A and then really, or maybe give an abstract and do that. This is all case-based discussion. So it's really about, you or I leading a 4 or 5 panel person group on, okay, here's a patient with wet AMD, present to your office. What imaging are you ordering? Why are you ordering that? What's the practicality of getting this imaging? How easy is it to do, OCTA in practice? Is it worth doing an OCTA and every patient walks in the door? These are some, I think, are really important questions. Then going on to the treatment. Okay, so I've started initiated treatment. What happened to the patient? Where did the patient go? What was the results? What were the biomarkers we saw in the first OCT that might have predicted this response? And then going on to kind of continuation of treatment over time to see what we can do to disease modify these patients. And in the future, what do we hopeful and looking for? So this is really the way that Kiowa has been setting itself apart from the others, because I think the others are more focused on, a didactic portion and then a lectureship and whatever. And I think that those are good, but I think we're really focused on trying to make it more conversational, more interactive. You expect people to really be participating, and so that's going to be the difference there for that meeting.
Rishi, you mentioned your time in Cleveland and at the Cole Eye Institute. You're now at Harvard. You just outlined your leadership role at various meetings. There are a lot of benefits afforded to being in leadership like this, but there's also a lot of costs to leadership. And I'm curious what you would say to the future Rishi Singhs that are out there. What would you tell them are, the real perks of being involved at that level, but also what, speaking realistically, what do you have to give up in order to have that capacity?
Yeah, so it's funny. We were just talking before we got on this podcast about my transitions and my movements, and I think that first of all, you can't be motivated by the financial gains. Number one, I think that that's a big misnomer. I think we're doing things that are passion projects will eventually lead to any benefit there for you, and I think that's hard sometimes because of all the pressures we have. We graduate with debt, and we have a lot of, obviously liabilities to worry about as time goes on. And, oh, we're doctors and we want to spend money on X, Y, and Z. Those are all tough things to deal with. And I sympathize incredibly with that. But I would say the last thing you want to do is make these decisions based upon money, fame, or fortune for that matter. I think that you have to do them because you're interested, you're motivated, and you want to make them great and leave a legacy behind. That's the way I've sort of run myself and done that. And I think that if I told myself this, maybe a long time ago, my younger self, it might be, be willing to take a little bit more risk early on. I don't think it's a bad thing, but obviously do it in a high integrity sort of way. Don't just pander, but just at least try to do this in a way that would be valuable and meaningful to you and others. And I think that positivity and that sort of, focus on what is important is really a great way of starting this process out overall.
Rishi, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing academic institutions? You've been at two great academic institutions, Cole and now Mass Eye and Ear. We're all facing a lot of issues, be it OR opportunities, retinal detachments getting turfed off to academic centers, this GLOBE project that we'll talk about in just a bit, reimbursement difficulties. What's the biggest challenges facing academic institutions right now?
Yeah, I think it's about keeping the mission of the training program and the research alive along the clinical mission. And to me, that was something that, again, I would say in hindsight seemed easy at the time, but became more and more difficult as time went on. And I think it's because of all the things you described, the private equity movement in the market and what changes that has to our practices and the cost involved in other aspects of our market and sort of those entities all becoming there. And quite honestly, I think, John, to be honest with you, private practice has done patient care quicker and faster than we have done in major academic centers, and hence that's why the volume is there. I think that we have to decide ourselves, for our group, in academic medical centers, how do we get to a place where people want to come and seek our care, right? That's ultimately what we're trying to go, the market share for people to come and see us. And I think what we're trying to do is develop innovative programs, develop new therapies or therapeutics that we only can offer here or might become more universal as time goes on, but that we're the cutting edge and that we really have the expertise for that and to gather people around that aspect. And I think people get that when you explain it to them. But I think the initial parts are really difficult, as you mentioned, to keep the mission going alongside everything else.
In recruiting physicians, and it's something that Cole did amazingly well. Matt Pioneer has great doctors, great retina specialists
Yeah.
there. How do you recruit well at these academic centers?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, it's about culture. I mean, I have to say that even most as of today, we have 6 recruits to get by the end of the year, and I'm talking to all of them before the end of the year. I think a chair's responsibility is to speak and talk to those people and to say that you're part of our family and that I'm here to listen and I'm here to help you. Even in a department as big as ours, we have 200 ophthalmologists that are either employed or part time in our group at this point in time. And so, even with all of those individuals, I'm willing to meet with them and to kind of have conversation around the watering hole or the coffee machine or whatever makes them happier. But I think that my job is now servant leadership, to be quite honest with you. I think you spent a lot of time, I think, up until this point in the limelight trying to get yourself the accolades and the kind of respect you hope to get through scientific discovery and inquiry, which I've done. My next stage is really about being, as you said, the connector, not being maybe the center of attention, but certainly highlighting those in my department that are doing amazing work and really being their lightning rod to their future careers. And so I think that that's where I sit from right now in this kind of focus and area.
You've always done that so well. How much easier does private equity make your job recruiting physicians?
Oh, it doesn't. I think
Okay.
I'll be honest with you. I think they're giving us a run for our money. I mean, I think they're a large part of every place that we go nowadays. I think private equity fills a very big need. There's a good group of people that want to be in practices that are turnkey, right? You walk in, things are taken care of for you. And John, you have to say, I mean, I know how many hours you spend with your own practice, nights, weekends, I'm sure, with the management side of it, and for that to be a little bit alleviated by the private equity groups is a value proposition. I think that there's different strokes for different folks, right? Some people want to be involved in those tripartite missions of clinical care, research and teaching, and they see us as an opportunity to grow their science and heck, we are also a great clinical engine. So let me be over there and get the cachet of being at Harvard. Big things to do, but it's not something that everyone can necessarily ascribe to. So I think for different people, it's different jobs, but I think that there's lots of opportunity out there. I'm never a naysayer against private equity, to be quite honest with you. I actually think it's part of our overall, kind of U.S. entrepreneurial spirit to have sort of that opportunity. There are people that will choose it, and people that say, you know what, I'll shut up a shingle next door and just be as successful as they will be. So it just depends on the person.
Rishi, in addition to all of this, you also collaborate with industry a lot. You
Yeah.
have a lot of deep relationships there. How do those relationships begin to form, and then how do you cultivate them over time? Because the deeper they become, the more time consuming they become, and you are
Yeah.
but one man with one clock and only one,
Yeah.
time to sleep each night. So how do they start, and then how do they grow?
Yeah, my Aura Ring has been telling me I have great amounts of sleep debt. I think that what I would say about that is never let the consultancy get in the way of your integrity. Make sure that you definitely give them the opinion of what you have. If they come in and they say, every retina specialist needs a flying car, and you really think, you really should know that, that's the way it is. Make sure you tell them that that's not the truth, and that we don't want flying cars as retina specialists. We want great drugs to make our patients see. And I think that some of the aspects to this can be very good if you're true to yourself. And hence, I think that's why I've become, popular in that way, both within the industry side, but in the banking side of the world of our practices to say, hey, what do you think? How much do you think this has legs to it? And because I'm a person who has, and I'm wrong, by the way, sometimes, right? I bet on things and I'll say, you know what, I think that this is not going to be a financial upside, and they'll still bet the other way because it's something they're shorting. I don't really understand all that. I just put it at what makes me think that patients are going to see better or even improved over what we're doing with these therapies. And that's what I'm kind of giving people advice on more so than I do about the, kind of slow and short term kind of gains and losses of their own market portfolios.
Now, Rishi, one last thing to kind of wrap up on the recent announcement by the government about the GLOBE Medicare Part B kind of demonstration project where they're going to try to do most favored nations pricing. And I know you've had a lot on your plate, so if you're not familiar with
Yeah.
it, it's okay. But how do you see that playing out? And should we be worried about that?
Well, I think the biggest issue for any of us in ophthalmology is if they start to get toward buy and bill medicine and eliminate that from our practices. I'm not so worried about Part B. I'm more worried about the Part D stuff and what's happening there. Part B has always, been a little bit of a cagey game in general. If you think about it, like, some of the drugs in Part B are available all across the world. And you've done this. You've gone to probably a foreign country and picked up the dose of antibiotic at $2 for the 7-day course versus, being, in the US, you might go and get a copay for $15 or $16 and tell us it's the innovation of the drug, which is highly generic and many years old, right? It doesn't make any sense to us. So I actually think it's helpful for patients. I think it may increase the access, things like GLP-1s as an example. I saw that they're even, lowering the price of those finally for people, and they're becoming much more affordable and much more reasonable. It's a good thing for patients ultimately from a standpoint of taking care of the population. Mehmet Oz is part of Medicare right now. And I have to say, I think the best is yet to come with him because I think Mehmet has an idea that we've been too focused on reactionary medicine and not focused enough on preventative medicine. And prevention means getting people access to drugs they need, like Part B medications. I think the biggest risk for any of us, if Part D is a risk, is going to be a risk for all of us, including healthcare companies like ours, academic medical centers, and practices like yours, because much of our revenue is based upon some of that buy and bill process. And we understand that. Not in a bad way. I think we're just the intermediaries for a lot of other situations that don't exist right now. And who's going to pay for this? The alternatives of Part D are like, do you write people a prescription for the Lucentis, go have them pick it up from their pharmacy, put it on their dashboard of their Buick as they drive in to see you and sit in the sun of Texas for 4 hours before they get it to you, and then it's all dead by then. And that's not a good scenario either. We spend the time to invest in things that keep the infrastructure there and as Part D. That's why we get reimbursed for those things. And I think that those are important things to consider. And hopefully that's not the case in the future, but that could be what we could be facing in the near term.
Yeah.
Rishi Singh is the Chair of Ophthalmology at Mass Eye and Ear and Mass General Brigham up in Boston. Rishi, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Scott and John. Appreciate being here.
Thanks, Rishi.
John, the FDA issued another complete response letter to Outlook Therapeutics. This is over ONS 5010. This was their attempt at FDA-approved bevacizumab for wet AMD. They were denied again. Is this the death knell for FDA-approved Avastin?
It sure feels like it. I mean, you
Okay.
know, and Outlook's put every effort into getting this approved. I think there's pluses and minuses, to it. I think the fear everybody's always had has been, would an FDA approved, bevacizumab eliminate compounded bevacizumab?
It's what we talked about before. Would it actually limit patient access?
Yeah, and that would be a nightmare if it did. I mean, listen, it's affordable, it's available for off-label indications, and so that would really create a big problem, for us, not only as far as access to care for patients with these unique diagnoses that aren't covered, but also for patients that have significant copay. And with Good Days, and other patient assistance funds going away, this is a big problem, if Avastin goes away, because that's our cheap alternative. So I don't think the FDA based it off of that. I think the FDA was looking at the clinical trial outcomes and the study design and all the things that the FDA, vets these things on. But I think as a retina specialist, this probably preserves compounded Avastin a lot longer than if it had been approved. And I don't know what the next step is for them.
Well, they're in Europe, right? They are commercially available in Germany and in the UK. Presumably, they'll get some expansion into the EU, where compounded Avastin is not an option. So I do think that there's a pathway forward for Outlook, but I'm not necessarily sure it's through the United States.
Yeah, it's funny because as I've been in Europe and giving some talks over there and at meetings over there, I do know, at least in the UK, it's one of the most expensive of the drugs as far as the cost of it. And
Oh,
so,
really?
from what I understand from my colleagues there, it's not very utilized. So that's also another, I think, detriment to their market share. You never know, Scott, what goes into the
Yeah.
thought process behind pricing these things and launches and things such as that. But yeah, that's what one of my retina brethren had said that practices in the UK is that it's an expensive option and that limits its utilization.
Yeah, especially in the landscape now of biosimilars. The value proposition for Avastin in the United States is that it's inexpensive, right? That's it. So if
100%.
that's taken off the table, I don't really know how big that slice of the pie can be.
Yeah, I mean, the only way that you could get a bigger slice of the pie is if you make it go away, and maybe you catch some of these insurance companies where they've tiered therapy and compounded Avastin goes away, and all of a sudden now you have an FDA approved version, and for a limited window you're able to slide it in and it fits, but that's not sustainable. The other option would be is if you get approved and you actually launch it at a reasonable cost, and I think something in that sub $200 range actually would make it reasonable, and then knowing that it's actually manufactured to go in the eye, and that it's up to a little more of a regimented processing and whatnot would make it a reasonable option.
All right, well, John, we're going to talk about this more in a future episode, so we'll wrap it for now. So, everybody, thank you for watching. That's our episode, and thank you for listening if you're on the podcast platform. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show. You can visit retinup.com to sign up for the newsletter. If you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment. We might bring it up on the show next time. And if you want to hear John's thoughts on anything related to your practice, your career, even something, I don't know, personal or just kind of remotely related to ophthalmology, email a voice recording to info@retinup.com. We've already had a few things in the mailbag. We're looking for one or two more, and then we're going to have a special mailbag episode. That's it for now. Thanks.